Okay, let's get started. Welcome all of you to this really exciting talk by Dr. Stéphane Lacroix. And welcome to the Middle East Studies program more broadly to this event in our fall semester. The program's Associate Director, Essie Lenchner, is going to be posting in the chat the other events for this semester. Be sure to check them out. There's a really great slate for this semester and also for next semester. Without further ado, I want to get to the talk as quickly as we can. My name is Aaron Roxinger. I teach in the Middle East History program at UW-Madison. It's my deep, deep pleasure to introduce Stéphane Lacroix. He's an associate professor of political science at Sciences Po and a researcher at Sciences Po's Centre de Recherche Internationale. His work deals with religion and politics with a focus on the Gulf and on Egypt. His first book, Awakening Islam, The Politics of Religious Dissent in Contemporary Saudi Arabia, is a landmark study of Islam and politics in Saudi Arabia, and he's also served as an editor for 3 additional volumes. So today I'm thrilled that we'll be listening to him discuss material from his second book on Salafism in Egypt. So without further ado, Stéphane, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's a great pleasure to be here. Sorry I couldn't be with you in Madison. It's especially a great pleasure to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience. So I've called my talk "The Struggle for Salafism in the Egyptian Transition." And the idea was that I've been a bit frustrated that most of what has been written on Salafism in Egypt in the context of the Egyptian transition was written about Hizb al-Nour, right? About the party that was established in 2011, came second in the parliamentary elections. And I'm guilty of that, by the way. I mean, I did write myself quite a few pieces on Hizb al-Nour. It's a very interesting object of study. But I think there's much more to say about Salafism in the context of the Egyptian transition. And we're gonna do that during the course of that talk. I mean, you know, Hizb al-Nour doesn't sum it up, right? You know, we're going to talk here about Hazem Salah Abu Ismail and the revolutionary brand of Salafism that flourished at some point during the Egyptian transition, not for very long, but that has not been the subject of a lot of studies. And we're going to talk more generally, and this is what's interesting for me in this talk, is about how the religious field, and of course we know and how interconnected it is with politics in the Arab world in Egypt. So how the religious field was during the transition literally dominated by Salafi sheikhs, who seemed to be the only ones able to provide the religious legitimacy that all groups were seeking. And that included the Brotherhood, right? So in that sense, what I'm trying to understand here, the thesis I'm going to develop here is that the political struggle in the Egyptian transition was accompanied by a struggle for Salafism that came to have a major impact on the political struggle itself. And looking at why and how this happened and with what consequences is basically what I want to do in this talk, right? To begin, some of you may know the immense and really useful literature that has been produced on the rise of political dissent in Egypt in the 2000s and the decades preceding the 2000s, and how the rise of that political dissent eventually led, in ways that were not predictable, to the Egyptian revolution of January 25th, 2011, right? So there's a whole history of, how, all these groups, the 6th of April, Kifaya, all of that kind of eventually led, again, in non-predictable ways, to what would become the Egyptian revolution. My claim is that this happened while something that was completely different was going on in the religious sphere, which is, to say it in a couple of words, the increasing hegemony of Salafism as religious norm. And this increasing hegemony of Salafism as a religious norm happens through decades, through a decades-long process that I can't address here, but that is the subject of my forthcoming book, so that's just a small part of it. But I'm sure many of you are aware of that. And of course, especially if you've read Aaron's excellent work, the book he published on the 70s, but I think that the new book addresses other periods. Some of you may have read Henri Lauzier's book as well, which looks at the previous period, like the first half of the 20th century. So there are a few works that kind of, trace that process in which Salafism, became increasingly hegemonic normatively. What I mean, by the way, by normatively here is that not everyone was a Salafi, but increasingly the Islamic standards tended to be redefined in a Salafi way, which again did not mean that people all practiced according to what they thought was the standard, right? So this is what I mean when I use the term normative here, right? I'm not going, as I said, to delve on that process here, but what I can say maybe is that the process of hegemonizing Salafism in the religious sphere accelerated somehow in the 2000s. And that had to do, obviously, with the internet and the new media. Because again, this question of the internet and the new media has been looked at a lot in the context of political dissent and how this, all facilitated dissent in Egypt and led to the revolution. There's a whole literature on that. But at the same time, the new media and the internet also facilitated another process, which was that Salafism would come to reach all segments of the Egyptian population in the 2000s through those new media and through the internet. And so the consequence was that by the late 2000s, the figures that literally dominated the religious sphere in Egypt, and I'm talking here not institutionally, but in terms of audience and outreach, well, those figures were Salafi figures with the triarchy of Muhammad Hassan, Muhammad Hussein Yaqub, and Abu Ishaq al-Huwaini being the three, if you went to Egypt in the late 2000s and you asked any Egyptian in the street to name 3 Muslim sheikhs, he would give you those 3 names probably, even if he didn't identify or he didn't look like a Salafi, right? Because those were the 3 sheikhs that you couldn't avoid. They were simply everywhere, right? So even within the Muslim Brotherhood, the influence of the Salafi religious norm was felt. And some of you may know, and I'm sure some of you do know, the article written by my late friend Hussam Tamam in 2010, in which Hussam identified this phenomenon and referred to it as tasalluf al-ikhwan, right? What he called the Salafization of the Brotherhood. And what Hussam meant was that there was a strong Salafi undercurrent in the Muslim Brotherhood, which in alliance with the organization's conservative leadership was transforming the Brotherhood's religious outlook, right? So he didn't say, I'm just speaking here for those of you who know the Brotherhood, that necessarily people like Ghirat Shater or the people at the leadership of the Brotherhood were necessarily Salafi themselves. But there was this type of alliance within the Brotherhood between a Salafi wing and a conservative leadership that eventually led to the Salafi discourse gaining ground within the Brotherhood itself. And that was very visible in the sense that traditional authorities like Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi were being sidelined in favor of a new group of sheikhs with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, who defended more conservative social and political views than Qaradawi himself, right? I'm speaking here about people like Safwat Hijazi, for those of you who know, or Waqdi Ghunaim, with the support in the conservative leadership of people like Ghirat al-Shater or Mahmoud Izzat, right? So just to name names for those of you who, again, want to know precisely what I'm talking about. This didn't go without resistance, by the way, within the Muslim Brotherhood. But those who disagreed were gradually sidelined. And some, like Abdel Munim Abul Futuh, who was the leading opponent to that Salafization, most of them would end up splitting up from the Brotherhood after the revolution. And Abul Futuh is a case in point. He would come to form his own party outside the Brotherhood, and he would run in the presidential election on his own name, without the name of the Brotherhood. And it's also quite telling. Some of you may have noticed that, right? And I think it was quite unexpected in some way for those who didn't follow what was going on within the Brotherhood, that al-Qaradawi completely disappeared from the Muslim Brotherhood's, events and messaging after the revolution, right? The only thing we have of Qaradawi is him giving a khutbah after the fall of Mubarak, on the Friday after the fall of Mubarak. And then Qaradawi is completely sidelined. We don't really see him anymore, right? And we see those other guys instead. And Qaradawi would, by the way, end up supporting Abu al-Futuh against Morsi in the presidential election of 2012. So kind of he went, all the way. So before I go any further, I maybe should define what I mean by Salafism here, right? Especially as we have a broad audience. And by the way, even among specialists, we may not all agree on how we precisely define Salafism, but it's also useful to just clarify what I'm talking about here. So I define Salafism as both a discourse and a method, right? The discourse is one that derives its authority from a range of religious figures from Islamic history. And to put it simply, that tends to adopt more conservative views on society than the traditional Azhari Islam that used to dominate in Egypt, right? So that is for the discourse. And I don't want to get into the specifics because this is not an Islamic studies seminar. I'm trying to stick to my talk, but there would be, of course, much more to say. As for the method, it is one that gives priority to the purity of creed, aqidah, right, over anything else, including politics. So for the Salafis, and this for me is the defining criteria, right? That idea of the purity of the creeds, of the aqidah, comes first before anything else. And so Salafis have typically seen da'wah, preaching, as the best method to reform society along Islamic lines. And they've typically been wary of politics because they saw political practice as an arena where the necessary compromises made by political forces would force them to renounce certain aspects of the pure creed, right? So they would see it as a trade-off, that if you get into politics, you will have to go against the creed as you understand it in its kind of pure form, as the Salafis define it. Of course, there's been debates among Salafis, and I don't want to get back into those again, on how much politics is permissible, right? What I think Salafis altogether share the same wariness towards politics. Even those who are more political than others still see that going too far in that direction means that eventually you are going to abandon the intransigence of the creed, right? Because politics will force you to make choices and decisions and alliances that would eventually contradict what the creed tells you to do. So in that sense, I think this kind of applies to all Salafis. And there's been a great number of articles and works trying to categorize Salafis. And usually the criteria has been, looking at, Salafis who are more political than others, right? And you do have Salafis who've, gone, who developed a political discourse that's more obvious than others. But they would all probably agree that politics is a dangerous subject. And even those who are political, like the ones I studied in Saudi Arabia, the Sahwa, who have a clear political discourse, they would generally be against political parties because they would see political partisanship as being the red line. So in that sense, there was a whole spectrum of Salafis, which again, all share that wariness towards politics, but again, to different degrees. The idea of prioritizing the creeds or the purity of the creed also has an impact on the Salafi relationship towards other groups. So Sufis, Shia, Christians, Salafis would typically take a harsher stance than traditional Muslims towards those groups. Salafis would see them as a threat against the purity of the creed. So they would put strict lines on how you can interact with them. On the Shia, they would more openly say that they are not Muslims. The Sufis would be openly denounced. So you have that kind of intransigence that derives from their understanding of the creed that is also quite typical of Salafis. there would be much more to say about Salafism here, but I'm just trying to give a quick overview so that you understand what I mean when I use the adjective conservative to talk about Salafis. It is conservative in that particular sense, right? So the point I'm making here is that 2011 saw the collision between those two very different and parallel processes. On the one hand, the one taking place in the political sphere was the rise of dissent and eventually the revolution. And on the other hand, the one that was taking place in the religious sphere was the gradual narrative hegemony, normative hegemony, of Salafism over that sphere, right? And in a sense, 2011 is the culmination of both processes, right? Of course, as I said, those were completely distinct processes, right? And the irony is that most Salafi sheikhs were against the revolution, right? Most Salafi sheikhs were not enthusiastic about the revolution when it started. They actually, waited until the very final days of the revolution to take a clear stance. Because, again, as Salafis, they believe that change will come from changing the creed. So, in a sense, it was coherent with their worldview, right? You have to do da'wah, you have to bring people back to a pure understanding of Islam. And this is the only way to change the country. One of them, and I'm not going to read the quote here, but Muhammad Ismail al-Muqaddim, for instance, who was one of these leading Salafi figures, would openly discuss this and say, what does it matter if we have this guy or this guy leading us? In the end, if society is the same, it's not going to change anything, right? So it's coherent from a Salafi perspective that you wouldn't be enthusiastic with change from above, because you believe that you have to change people from within first. And this is where, the eventual change at the social level will come from. So in that sense, Salafis were pretty coherent, right, in not supporting the revolution. There was a tiny fraction of them that did support the revolution. So, and those were the most political ones, right? I talked before about how there was a spectrum, right? So the ones that, already had a clear political discourse before the revolution, usually it was a political discourse that was anti-Mubarak, or they would openly denounce the impiety of Mubarak. And those, of course, were much more likely to see the revolution as an opportunity to get rid of a tyrant, right? The other ones would say they're all the same. This guy, Baradei, whoever you bring, it's going to be the same. So that tiny faction is important. We're going to come back to them. What Viktorovich would call the politicos, right? He has coined this term that has stayed with us in the field for 15 years. So, there was a tiny faction, but they were really a minority in Egypt, right? But they did have a few figures. And those were the ones who could say proudly, I was with the revolution from the start. But again, it was a tiny minority, right? The other ones would say, no, protect the creed, revolutions are bad. So what I'm trying to argue here is that the interplay between the two processes I described, right? Salafi hegemony and a political process leading to a revolution and the political transition. I'm trying to argue that the interplay between those two processes during the transition would have major consequences and explains a number of things that happened during the transition in better ways than have been explained by until now, I think. At least that's what I'm trying to argue. So, of course, I would argue that there are three consequences, right? The most visible consequence was the formation of Salafi parties, right? The fact that some Salafi organizations in the wake of 2011 decided to form political parties. And it was especially the case for what was before 2011 the biggest grassroots Salafi organization, which called itself the Da'wah Salafiyya, the Salafi Call. And that organization formed in June 2011 the party called Hizb al-Nur, right? The Party of Light, which is the one that eventually came second with 25% of the votes in the parliamentary elections of late 2011, the first parliamentary elections after the revolution. I'm not going to speak about this extensively because this is something I've done before many times and I've written about this. So I don't want to focus too much on that. What I've tried to argue here is that those, and especially that Salafi party, Hizb al-Nur, which became the second political force in Egypt, it was not what you would call an Islamist party, right? And this is where I would take a different look at it. If you understand why the sheikhs, who were always wary of politics, who were not with the revolution, eventually decided that forming a party was a good thing, it was not because they thought that this was a way to seize power, because they didn't believe in seizing power. So why would they form a party? Right? They did form a party because they believed that in a context in which the political balance of power was being redefined in the transitional political sphere, it mattered for them to have someone to represent their interests as a religious organization. So basically, when I say it was not an Islamist party, it was not an Islamist party in the sense that it was not a vehicle to capture power. It was the lobbying arm of a religious organization, right? This is what I've argued in other of my works, and I'm not gonna delve too much on that, but it explains many of the things they did, right? They were not, for instance, interested in presenting a candidate to the presidency. They didn't. What they wanted was to control, as large as possible number of seats in the parliament, and they could use those as the bargaining chip with whoever would win to say, look, this is what we want. We are a religious organization, and what we want is to expand. So what we want for the religious organization to expand is A, B, C, D, E. But you can keep power for yourselves. So in a sense, it kind of, I've made that comparison before. It kind of resembles what, and I understand it's been changing, but what Orthodox parties have been doing in Israel, right? So you have that type of thing. I understand that they've become more political with time, but at the beginning was the same idea. A religious organization that has schools and believes that changing society comes from below, that forms a political party to defend and to protect the interests of that religious organizations from below, right? So in that sense, it's a different way of functioning than what a regular Islamist party would do, which again, would consider that change comes from above and through seizing power and controlling the state. So that this is what makes the Salafi so different, and that Salafi party Hizb al-Nur so different. And that explains why Hizb al-Nur hated the Brotherhood so much, right? I mean, Hizb al-Nur's whole, activity during the 2 years of the transition was basically to try to undermine the Muslim Brotherhood as much as they could. And the reason why they did this, again, if you understand where they came from, is pretty logical. They did this because they believed that if the Brotherhood become politically hegemonic, they would use that political hegemony to become religiously hegemonic. And so they will exclude them from the religious markets. So for them, if you follow that perspective, it's much easier to make a deal with, a liberal party, with the army even, than with the Brotherhood, because at least the liberals or the army are not competing for the same thing as you are. You're competing for the mosques. This is what you care about, right? You can make a deal with a secular force by saying you take politics, we take the mosques. You can't do that with the Brotherhood because the Brotherhood wants politics and the mosques, right? So in that sense, that explains why that group was particularly afraid of the Brotherhood, because again, they were absolutely convinced that if the Brotherhood should manage to establish political hegemony, the first thing they would do is appoint Brotherhood imams to all the mosques and exclude the Salafis. So that explains to you why Hizb al-Nur was so anti-Brotherhood during those 2 years. Again, I don't want to come back to it, but I'll come back to it later, but I don't want to delve too much into that because I have more things to say. So, so that was the first, right, manifestation of how important Salafism was going to become in the transition, right? The fact that a party that emerged from a Salafi religious organization came second with 25% of the seats in the parliament in the parliamentary election, and came also, as I said, in clear opposition to the Brotherhood. But that's, and they would oppose Morsi. I mean, we'll see that it was complicated, but generally their stance was pretty much directed against the Brotherhood. And they eventually backed the coup, right? It was the only religious party to back Sisi when he overthrew Morsi. So that was the first manifestation, right? The second manifestation of Salafism during the transition was that because Salafism was, again, normatively hegemonic in the religious sphere, it could also be turned on its head to make it the language of religious populism, right? And that's an argument I'm trying to make here. You know, the argument is that, like, when a discourse becomes hegemonic, it runs the risk of being reinterpreted by those who assign it a different meaning, right? And this is exactly what happened with the rise of a populist Salafi movement in 2011 that was completely distinct from the one I told you until now, Hizb an-Nur, and that emerged from the grassroots and around the figure of a sheikh called Hazem Salah Abu Ismail, right? So that you understand what I mean, I'm going to give you some details about that sheikh, and you can see where he comes from. So Hazem was born, I will call it Hazem throughout, because he's called Hazem Salah Abu Ismail, so I'll shorten it to Hazem. So Hazem was born in 1961 to a Muslim Brotherhood family. And his father was a prominent figure of the Muslim Brotherhood. He actually sat in the Egyptian parliament from the late 1970s, representing an Islamist line. His father is Salah Abu Ismail. Hazem became a lawyer. He was trained as a lawyer. He was a member of the MB for a great part of his life. But in the 2000s, he became one of these figures of the MBs of the Muslim Brotherhood's Salafi wing that I talked about before, right? And he made a name for himself preaching on Salafi channels that were quite widespread in the 2000s. So he made a name as a Salafi preacher on these channels. And if you watched him then, you probably wouldn't know he was a Muslim Brotherhood member, because he really appeared, he had the whole, even in the way he dressed, he would usually come up with a tunic and a turban, and he would talk about the end of the world and themes that, and the torments of the grave, and themes that, are pretty, prominent in Salafi speech, and that, would generally not be the ones that, the much more political Muslim Brotherhood would care for. So he made a name for himself as a Salafi sheikh, although he still pertained to the Muslim Brotherhood. And he was one of these people, as I said, who within the Brotherhood, were changing the organization's religious outlook. He left the Muslim Brotherhood at some point, but it's unclear if it was before or right after the revolution. But he left the Muslim Brotherhood at some point. And when the revolution happened, Hazem was one of the few Salafi sheikhs who actually sided with the revolution. He was one of those I told you about before. He was part of that tiny minority of Salafi sheikhs who from the beginning sided with the revolution. And after the fall of Mubarak, when the Muslim Brotherhood and Hizb an-Nur and all established religious forces started to think about the next stage and the seats they wanted to get in the parliament and the necessary compromises they had to make with the army, Hazem stood out by adopting a radical revolutionary anti-army stance, right? That resembled the same stance of the revolutionary youth, the secular one, that basically was the revolution's not over until the army's gone, right? What was different, though, is that Hazem cloaked it in a Salafi discourse, right? He was a Salafi sheikh. He was speaking the language of revolution, but he was doing it by, somehow connecting Salafi religious intransigence with revolutionary intransigence, right? In a sense, people talk about, revolutionary purity. So in that sense, he was connecting between revolutionary purity and religious purity, right? So he was quite unique in doing that, right? And again, in reframing the language of revolutionary politics in a Salafi way. He declared his candidacy to the presidency, and he didn't really believe that, as a Salafi, that the existing political system was the right, way to change things. But he was, and he was hoping for an Islamic state instead. But he used that, his, run for the presidency, as a fantastic platform to make him known to the people, right? Now he was a candidate, right? And he declared, he was the first person in Egypt to declare his candidacy to the presidency, May 2011. The election took place a year after, right? So then, he made himself known as a presidential candidate. And by doing that, he became more and more well-known, and he gathered around himself tens and later hundreds of thousands of people who saw him as representing some form of religious and revolutionary purity, right? In that sense, he was, the ideal, fusion of the two. And the more the Muslim Brotherhood and Noor were seen as compromising, on their ideas with the army, etc., the more he was becoming popular, because, he was again appearing as, the only incorruptible candidate, the only one that, would never compromise either on the revolution or on Salafi Islam, right? He became so popular that, in early 2012, his picture was everywhere in Egypt, right? You couldn't go to any place without seeing posters of Hazem Salah Abu Ismail. So he was a major phenomenon back then, right? And it's quite interesting that, people tend to have forgotten him because it didn't last for very long, but it was an incredible episode to witness. And in February 2012, he was ranked first in some of the electoral polls that were run, right? So there was a genuine risk that he would actually win. As I said, his platform was clearly populist in the sense that he denounced all the elites, right, including the other Islamist parties, right, because he accused them of, again, being, too compromising and, not faithful enough to Islam and to the revolution. And so he, in contrast, wanted to appear as the fusion of Islam and the revolution, right, of, Sharia and Karama, if you want, right? It's like, and he made it clear that for him, Karama, dignity, was only possible through Sharia, right? And that Sharia was Karama, right? So he would, even in his speeches, fuse the slogans of the revolution with the religious slogans. Some of the activists of the time and some of his followers actually, referred to him then as the Khomeini of the Egyptian revolution, and later on, after he was out of the game, they would say, if there had been a Khomeini in the Egyptian revolution, it would have been him, right? Islamists absolutely hated him, right? Because they, and especially Hezbollah Noor, right? Because he was a Salafi, or claimed to be a Salafi like them, but of course he was basically making Salafism something very different from what they wanted it to be, right? So in a sense, they hated him even more that he was basically chasing on their lands, and using the same type of discourse, but with a completely different method, right? And the Muslim Brotherhood and Hezbollah Noor, so like if this guy was to be elected, it would be a catastrophe for them, because they have no control over him, and that would pose a genuine problem for them as organizations to have such an uncontrollable president, and one over which they that doesn't represent them, and what I wanted to say is that everyone hated him as well. Of course, you can imagine that the secular forces hated him as much, right? There was one of these coups de théâtre, as we say, and one of these surprises that there were many in the Egyptian Revolution, when in early April 2012, when he was still running first in the elections, in the polls, he was ousted from the race because the electoral courts declared that they had received proof that his mother had received American citizenship. And so he could no longer be a candidate, because in Egyptian electoral law, you cannot have members of a direct family who are dual nationals. So that was the argument. He always denied it, right? But of course, he defended himself by saying this is not true. Some of the more committed followers defended him and say this is a lie and this is a conspiracy to get him out of the race. But everyone was so relieved, including all the other Islamists, right? And so he was out of the race. There was one consequence to this, right? And one consequence that had a major impact later on. The Muslim Brotherhood had pledged not to present a candidate to the presidency. And they did, break that promise at this very moment. Because this is when the Muslim Brotherhood presented first Khairat al-Shatir. And because he couldn't run, they presented Muhammad Mursi. And the real narrative for what they presented Muhammad Mursi is because of Abu Ismail. Right? The Muslim Brotherhood wouldn't say that. They would say that there was a candidate from the old regime who actually presented itself right after, who was Omar Suleiman. And the Muslim Brotherhood would make it much better to say we had to present a candidate because we had to counter the threat of the old regime. But the real reason was Abu Ismail. Right? And I can tell you this from interviews, right? Because they were really scared that he would take the Islamist vote away from them. In that sense, although Hazm's movement was short-lived, it did have a consequence. It pushed the Brotherhood to break one of its promises, present a candidate to the election, and by presenting a candidate to the election, go to a clash with the army, which would eventually happen, right? Now, let me look at the third consequence, and I have a bit less than 10 minutes for that, right? Of this kind of dominance of Salafism in the religious discourse of the transition. In 2011, the Muslim Brotherhood was absolutely obsessed at trying to capture the Salafi base, right? Because they knew it was strong. The Muslim Brotherhood back then knows that there is a strong Salafi constituency, and they need to take that constituency. And of course, the leadership, we saw that, in the religious outlook of the Brotherhood had kind of moved closer to the Salafi outlook in the 2000s, was what I described before. So, there was ground for that type of, effort to try to capture the Salafi base. The first major move of the Muslim Brotherhood was to make an alliance with the more political Salafis I talked about before, the ones who sided with the revolution, right? And they would try to start to cater to these people, to try to host them, to establish links with them. They knew that they were a minority among Salafis, so they would give them positions, honors, and everything. One of these political Salafis formed in February 2011 a body called Al-Hay'a Al-Shari'iyya Lil-Huquq Wal-Islah, the Religious Committee for Rights and Reform. That was a religious committee that presented itself as, a body to provide religious guidance to Egyptians in the time of transition. And that body was made up exclusively of Salafis. Salafis of all different currents. You had Salafi from the big organizations such as the Da'wah Salafiyya that I talked about, the one that formed Hizb Nur. You had Salafis from the Salafi wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. You had Salafis from the political Salafis I told you about. You had Salafis from the traditional organizations such as Ansar al-Sunnah, right? So you didn't have a blend of the different currents of the Salafis. The guy who created this is called Muhammad Yusri Ibrahim, very important guy in that whole episode. Because that guy actually spent 20 years of his life in Saudi Arabia and is basically the closest thing you have in Egypt, for those of you who know Saudi Arabia, to a Sahwi. He's one of the Sahwa, but in Egypt. He's one of these political Salafis that emerged in Saudi Arabia in the 80s and 90s. And that was very connected to them, but Egyptian. So he was himself very political, as I said, and very close to the Muslim Brotherhood in that sense, because they could agree on politics, even if they disagreed on other things. That body that was formed, the Religious Committee for Rights and Reform, would gradually be used by the Muslim Brotherhood as a way to try to control the Salafi leadership and get them to vote in favor of the Brotherhood, right? To provide a Salafi religious legitimacy to the Brotherhood's political choices. And you can see that quite clearly. In April 2012, for instance, that body, and you could see the Muslim Brotherhood's influence within that body, voted to support Mohammed Morsi. That is, to provide a Salafi legitimacy to the election of Mohammed Morsi. This is right the moment when the members of the Salafi Qawm, the Salafi Da'wah, those who support the Hezbollah actually left the body. I mean, they first boycotted and then they left and they said, it's unfair. This is a Muslim Brotherhood conspiracy to, to trick us Salafis into supporting them. So, but what is interesting after that is that the Muslim Brotherhood would remain completely obsessed with Salafis, both because the Muslim Brotherhood felt that they needed to neutralize Salafis, to prevent Salafis from, competing with them on religious grounds. So the Muslim Brotherhood needed to be more Salafi than the Salafis. But at the same time, the Muslim Brotherhood also felt an urge to cater to the Salafi constituency. And that explains why, starting in spring 2012, the Muslim Brotherhood's discourse becomes completely Salafi now. When Mohammed Morsi organizes electoral meetings, and I've attended a few, he would always bring Salafi figures on stage. Muhammad Abdul Maqsood and Safwat Hijazi were the two religious speakers at his meeting in Cairo. So you would only have Salafis there. And then the Muslim Brotherhood were stuck, because the more they did this, the more they Salafized their discourse, the less they could appeal to the secular or centrist forces, right? So they were stuck with the Salafis. But they were in a sense victims of their own game. So when it came to the constitution, for instance, and voting on the constitution late 2012, the Muslim Brotherhood had no choice but to make an alliance with Salafis to adopt a very conservative constitution, right? Because again, making an alliance towards the center with centrist or more liberal forces was no longer an option, right? And even after the vote of the constitution, the Noor party betrayed the Muslim Brotherhood. I told you that they hated them from the beginning. There was a temporary agreement on let's get a conservative constitution out together. But then Noor decided to go its own way and join the opposition against the Brotherhood. And yet the Brotherhood continued until the end to try to appeal to Salafis. They appointed a Salafi Minister of Religious Affairs, Mohammed Yusri Ibrahim, actually, the one I told you about, probably as a reward for being such a helpful guy in trying to get the Salafis on board with them. Actually, there was a backlash, so they had to appoint another guy, Tal'at Afifi, who was also a Salafi. When Mohammed Morsi was in deep trouble in January 2013, what did he do? He brought a Salafi sheikh to Egypt. Muhammad al-Arifi made a visit to Egypt, and he gave a speech in the Mosque of Al-Azhar and a few other, mosques, and that was presented as a major event. This Salafi from Saudi Arabia is coming to support Mohammed Morsi in times of trouble. And Morsi would continue to do that. In June 2013, 3 weeks before the coup, he organized a major event on Syria in Cairo. That was basically a call to support the Syrian revolution, but framed in a clearly Salafi discourse. All the people attending were Salafi sheikhs, some of them Egyptian, some of them Saudi. And the discourse was very radical, on Alawis especially. They were declared to be infidels, and the Syrian conflict was presented as a jihad against the infidels. The Muslim Brotherhood kind of, were driven in that direction until the end. That actually would have major consequences, right? The first of them, as I said, is that, it increased the polarization that existed in Egypt. As I said, the more Salafi the Brotherhood became, because they were convinced that they needed to neutralize the Salafi threat and cater to the Salafi constituency, the less likely they were to make, alliances at the center, sorry, speaking too fast. And eventually, they would fuel the narrative of those who would overthrow them. If you were in Cairo after the coup, everyone who was anti-Morsi would refer to the Syria conference as being, this is the reason why we really needed to overthrow him, because he was crazy and he was preaching jihad in Cairo. And so, you clearly understand why politically he was doing this, right? But at the same time, he was doing it in a moment when the battle was already lost. And the Salaf, and the Muslim Brotherhood could only continue to cater to the Salafi base that was no longer willing to save them should a coup come as it did. So in that sense, and I finish on this, my final conclusion, Aaron, is that I think that all of this is important, right? To reintroduce the impact of Salafism in the Egyptian transition, right? It is important, not just through Hizb an-Nur, but through the three different stories I've told you, right? Salafis forming political party, Salafis as a populist movement, challenging Islamist parties on populist grounds, and the Salafi, competition between the Muslim Brotherhood and all the others, right? These stories are really important because they show you why, what happened in Egypt, was so different than what happened in Tunisia, right? And if you compare the two, you go back to the old Tunisia-Egypt competition. One common explanation is that Ennahda was more moderate than the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And because Ghannouchi had written books back in the 90s in which he was much more open to pluralism, and that the Muslim Brotherhood was much more conservative. It is quite true, but what I'm trying to argue here is that it was not just about ideology, right? In a sense, the Muslim Brotherhood was driven also by the logic of the process it was in and the possible alliances that were available. So the fact that there was no Salafi competitor to Ennahda clearly, goes a long way in explaining why Ennahda could make alliances at the center and not the Muslim Brotherhood. That's my final word. Thanks.
Stéphane, thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating talk that really fused knowledge of the granular details of Salafism in Egypt during this period with an eye to this bigger picture. First of all, I want to give you a second to kind of catch your breath. And right now we're going to shift to the Q&A. So if folks can just, you can either type your questions in the chat, you can do the hand raising symbol under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen, and I will call on people to, and I'll call on you and I'll unmute you if you're raising your hand.
You can ask for clarifications because I think sometimes that was a bit quick. So if there's anything that was much too unclear, please ask.
Yeah, Daniel, go ahead. Let me unmute you. I think I asked to unmute you.
Yes, and then I had to confirm it. First of all, thank you, Stéphane, for a fascinating talk. It's been a while since I've seen you, so it's very good to catch up on what you've been working on. I have a few questions that relate primarily to intra-Salafi scene, perhaps unsurprisingly. First of all, I'm curious, to what extent, if any, was there resistance within Adawa Salafiyya to the political turn and the formation of Hizb an-Nur? I think I've seen on some message boards mention of the name Said al-Rubashi, for example, who was once a senior in the movement and who is, at least in the early 1980s, was very much of the opinion that parliaments and elections were polytheism, as I'm sure you know. The second question, where would you place the Al-Jamaa al-Islamiyya guys? I mean, I think I consider them more within the Salafi spectrum, but taking into account also the Muraja'at, etc. And third, kind of the space that opened up for, let's say, peaceful dawah on the part of Salafi jihadis, people like Ahmad Ashush. To what extent was that influential? I guess in the context of your basic framework, which is that, not to look at these movements in isolation, but who is exerting pressure on whom as far as what their political, what the possibilities were for them within, as far as being able to maneuver politically. So three kind of interconnected questions, but be very interested to hear your take on them.
Thank you. Should I respond straight away? Yes. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. It's a pleasure to see you. Your book has been really helpful, by the way, in in this last work I've been doing. So yeah, it's great to have that conversation. Well, there was resistance to the formation of a political party. I mean, at the beginning, most of the sheikhs were against. The initiative to form Hizb al-Noor actually came from a fringe member of the organization, Ahmed Abdel Ghafour, who actually, had lived in Turkey many years and was completely fascinated by the experience of Islamic politics in Turkey, and basically wanted to create an equivalent of the AKP, but in a Salafi way. And he, because he was kind of, one of the founders of the movement, but one that had kind of moved away from the movement, still carried authority with them, especially on the religious ground, he was able to kind of get the sheikhs, to agree more or less to the formation of a political party. At the beginning, they were not enthusiastic, right? And if you look at the first statements, the sheikhs say, Hizb al-Noor is independent from the Da'wah Salafiyya. Like, we kind of support them, but we don't. Like, so you really understand that the sheikhs at the beginning are trying to, say, well, if it works, we'll benefit from it, but if it doesn't work, we don't want to be associated with that, right? So you can clearly see that the backing of the sheikhs at the beginning is really really distant, right? And you do have people like Said al-Ghubashi, and you do have a number of sheikhs who are more opposed, and others who are kind of hesitant, but say, okay, because they trust this guy, so they say, okay, go ahead, see what you can do. And I think it kind of changes when Hizb al-Noor gets 25%, because now they understand that they have a fantastic means of pressure. And now all the sheikhs suddenly get interested. They all want to control the party. And this leads actually to a clash within the party. I've written about that, where you have some of the guys who founded the party with the approval of the sheikhs, but believed that they were doing this independently from the sheikhs, simply with the backing of the sheikhs, who would say, no, but we are doing our party. I mean, it's great to have your backing, we want it, but we want to do politics. And the sheikhs say, no, this is not what was intended. This is the lobbying arm of the religious organization. So you have to tell what we tell you. You have to do what we tell you, right? And this would lead to the split with Hizb al-Watan if you followed that late 2012. I mean, that was very much the reason for the split. But there was immense debates between those Salafis in the Dawah Salafiyya, again, first, as I said, on forming a party, and then on what the party was for, right? What do we need a party for, right? And so the line that I've described in my talk is the one that ended up winning. But there were other lines and people who ended up leaving, and who, so, many conflicts within the party. When it comes to the Jama'ah Islamiyya that you mentioned, well, Al-Jama'ah Islamiyya certainly is and is not a Salafi party. I mean, it depends on, again, it's all about the definition of Salafism, I think. In a sense, this kind of, the Jama'ah Islamiyya is, interested in that notion of purity of the creed and everything. But politics always came first to the Jama'ah Islamiyya when it was a militant organization. I mean, you see what I mean? I mean, what they were looking for when they read Ibn Taymiyyah was justifications for a violent revolution. It was not so much, details on what you should wear and how you should eat, as a regular Salafi would do, right? Salafis would take Ibn Taymiyyah much more in that sense. So for them, politics was always first. It is why, if we continue on that definition, that this trade-off between politics and creed, I would put the Jama'ah Islamiyya as a group that kind of had politics prevail over the creed. It is true that after the revisions, because then politics was supposedly no longer an option, they became more akin to a Salafi group for a while. But if you look at how they behaved politically during the transition, I mean, they really were, much more interested in politics than in the type of da'wah thing that the Da'wah Salafiyya was interested in. And they would end up, becoming very staunch allies of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they would fall with the Muslim Brotherhood. In that sense, the stance that they took is quite unique, I think. It's a mix of where they come from, their experiences. But so, yeah, I mean, the thing is, the definition of Salafism is always very tricky. I think we cannot give we have to define it, each one of us, before we because otherwise, if we want to make it a useful object of study, we need to say what we mean. And in the sense that I define it, I would probably keep them outside. But I would totally understand if someone wants to consider them to be Salafis, because they, on many other grounds, they are very Salafi. So, and when it came to Ahmed Ashoush and these jihadis, I mean, in a sense, Hazm Salah Abu Ismail, got with him a lot of these people, right? A lot of jihadis, when they saw Hazm proposing, revolution and Sharia, they kind of got excited. He was basically offering to them what they wanted, but he was convincing them that you could do it through, the streets and no longer weapons. So quite a number of jihadis actually went with him. Ahmed Ashoush didn't go with Hazm and actually wrote a book about Hazm. And he did that because one thing that he had against Hazm was that Hazm declared himself a presidential candidate, which by doing this, he was basically legitimizing the system. And he was accepting the idea that you could get elected through elections, and so the whole idea of elections was right. And so by doing this, you were validating the constitution. And so basically, he's like many of the jihadis who supported Hazm did it on strategic grounds. They understood that Hazm didn't care so much about the presidency. He cared about the movement that he was forming that was eventually going to take over the state. But Ashoush took a more procedural line and said, no, you cannot do this. You cannot, you can use the batil, even if it's to do the haqq. You cannot do something wrong, even if you have a good reason to do so. Or the means do not justify the ends. So in that sense, that was the kind of critique. So you did have also splits. I mean, we could talk about those splits for hours. During those years, it's like everyone forming their own opinions and clashes between all these different individuals and groups. But yeah, I think I've kind of responded. Thanks, Damien.
We have a question in the chat from Judy Hansen, and here I'm quoting, from 2011 to 2014, how did foreigners such as Syrians feel about the change in leadership from Mubarak to Morsi to Sisi?
So do you mean foreigners in Egypt, or do you mean like foreign revolutionaries?
Judy, would you like me to unmute you? Let's see, one second. Let's see if I can't unmute you so you can clarify. All right, excellent. Go ahead.
Okay, I would say foreigners who were living in Egypt.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So, I mean, I think it really depended on, I mean, you cannot make a broad categorization. It would really depend. I think that obviously the Muslim Brotherhood was seen as more sympathetic to the Syrian revolution. But by the time the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, the Syrian revolution was also taking a much more Islamic flavor, right? So in that sense, so Morsi was very open in his support for the revolution, but by doing this, he was also supporting a certain type of Syrian revolution. So in that sense, probably it would depend where you stand, as a Syrian. If you're in Egypt, for instance, if you are pro-regime, you wouldn't want the Muslim Brotherhood. If you are a secular revolutionary, you probably would not really much like the Muslim Brotherhood either, because you would see them as supporting the other side in Syria. If you're a more religious Syrian revolutionary, you probably love the Muslim Brotherhood, because you would think that finally Egypt is going to come to help the Syrian brothers, which they kind of didn't do except rhetorically. But still, they did have a price, right? Because when in 2013, Sisi came to power after the coup, there were a number of speeches coming from pro-Sisi people, basically blaming Syrians and Palestinians on the Morsi presidency. Through basically kind of a weird way of thinking that was because basically, because there's Hamas and because there's a Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, because Morsi was pro-Syrian revolution and pro-Palestine, obviously, as a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and pro-Hamas, more obviously. So that meant that all Syrians and Palestinians were somehow responsible for the victory of Morsi, which kind of led actually to very nasty scenes during the summer of 2013, where some Syrians and Palestinians were actually attacked in Cairo. accused of being Muslim Brotherhood supporters, even if they had nothing to do with it. So yeah, that kind of created the tension. Things kind of came back to normal afterwards. But there was a moment of tension in Cairo during those months after the coup.
All right. Matthias has a question. Go ahead, Matthias.
Thank you very much, Stéphane, for very interesting talk. I look forward to reading your forthcoming book. I was wondering if you could perhaps clarify what exactly you meant about the Salafi hegemony that came into shape in Egypt. I know that it's a big question, and Aaron has been written about it, and Henri Le Sueur has also been written about it. But I was wondering if you could perhaps clarify what your take on this hegemony is. Like, when exactly did it begin to take shape in Egypt, and how did it come about?
Thank you very much, Matthias, for the question. So let me clarify what I mean by hegemony. I don't mean that that everyone is a Salafi, obviously not, and I don't mean that anyone even normatively believes in the normative understanding of Islam as per Salafis. What I say is that what you see growing, and this kind of reaches this culmination point in 2011, is where Salafi standards of the correct Islamic practice gradually become accepted by most people. Most would probably be, maybe, I don't want to quantify how many, maybe 2/3, of Muslims in Egypt. You probably would still find lots of people who would say, oh, no. And so I'm not trying to overgeneralize here, but you would have a majority, let's put it that way, a sizable, majority of the population that sees those standards as being what represents correct Islamic belief and practice, right? It doesn't mean that they would always, what they consider to be the theory would not always correspond to their actual practices. But for instance, if you, and if you look at the work of Samudi Shilka, for instance, on Mawlids, you can clearly see that, Sufi practices such as Mawlids, have kind of lost the battle of hegemony, right? In the 2000s, most Egyptian Muslims you would ask would tell you that it's wrong, that it's not Islam. The same people who tell you that sometimes would go to the Mawlid, by the way. And you would ask them why, and they would say, because it's fun. And this is the whole, this is basically what Samudi writes in his book on the politics of fun, right? So people would also dissociate what they consider to be the norm and what their actual practices would be. But by the late 2000s, there would be an increasing agreement in the Muslim religious sphere in Egypt that the celebration of a saint in a Mawlid is not an Islamic practice, right? So questions like this one, I've taken this one as an example, but you could multiply the questions that would show you that. And of course, Aaron's book, I think, is going to give us more meat in terms of, thinking of all of that. So, so this is basically what I mean. And also the fact that, the religious fields is increasingly dominated by Salafis, right? So when people listen, to, religious programs, when they get, where they get their views from on matters of religion, they tend to get mostly from Salafi sheikhs because they're everywhere. Because it's very difficult actually if you want to get access to an Islamic discourse in the late 2000s in Egypt, do not find a Salafi sheikh, right? Except if you're lucky or not, depends on what you want. But if you have a mosque in your neighborhood that still has a traditional Azhari guy who comes, you may have that. But if you go on TV, if you go everywhere, that the religious sphere literally saturated by not just Salafi speech, but Salafi authorities, right? This is what I'm trying to capture with that term. And actually, I'm more careful in my book. I said hegemony here. I usually use quasi-hegemony because I don't want to say, again, I know plenty of Egyptians who would say, of course, we were not like that. And it's true. You would find plenty of people who were not like that. It's the general trend, right, that we're trying to capture here, Mm-hmm. And again, there would be a class phenomenon as well. Probably, in certain social classes, it would be much more widespread than in others. So it also depends on which class you're talking to. And But you would see that that speech, I mean, I think we can all agree that in the late 2000s, you know, in Egypt, that speech has kind of reached a very strong momentum, right? And that goes back decades before. I mean, it's a cumulative effect,
Yeah.
that of decades of religious transformation, right?
Thank you so much for answer.
All right. Now we have two questions upcoming. The first is from a student in History 370, Rida Ali, who asks, could you clarify and elaborate on what exactly purity of creed means for Salafis? How does Salafism's idea of prioritizing pure creed differ from those of other branches of Islam? And then we'll turn to a question from Cole Bunzel.
Okay. So the term purity really comes from something that the Salafis tend to call tasfiyah, right? So purification is something that is there is this notion in Salafism that there is one pure creed. There is only one understanding of creed that is valid, right? And by creed, you mean here everything that is related to the questions of Islamic belief, right? And what those questions of Islamic belief imply. So on basically, the nature of God, and what belief in the correct nature of God implies, sometimes in terms of social implications or religious implications, right? So for Salafis, for instance, something like in the interpretations of the attributes of God are something that is contrary to the correct creed. You cannot interpret the attributes of God. You cannot do ta'wil as the Ash'aris would do. And so this means that the Ash'aris are, for the Salafis, outside Islam. They're not pure because their creed is polluted by interpretation, right? So of course, what they define as purity is socially constructed, right? Let's be clear, right? I mean, the notion of purity in Salafism is socially constructed from a set of authors, which the Salafis declare to be the source of all authority, and because they believe that they are the faithful followers of the early Muslims, and that they stick to the words of the early Muslims. And so by doing this, they define a very a conception of the creed and what it implies. And purifications means basically promoting and going back to that conception of the creed and its implications, right? Which means that, for instance, the rejection of Sufism for Salafis is a question of creed. It's not something open to discussion. You cannot be a Muslim and a Sufi, because if you do things Sufi, then it means your aqidah is no longer a Salafi aqidah, right? And purifying the creed here would mean abandoning the belief that leads you to adopting those practices and adhering to the correct creed, which considers that monotheism implies the rejection of the belief in saints, for instance, right? I hope I was clear. This is a question I'm always, when I get too much into these kind of Islamological questions, I don't want to. I want to be clear. Those are very difficult questions that require a whole article, but.
Stéphane, this is why they're stuck with me for another half of the semester. They're going to have to learn all about this.
So, Aaron, I let you complete. I let you complete the.
Cole, go ahead.
Unmuted. Stéphane, thanks for the great talk. Good to see you. I am one of the people who also loves Islamological questions.
I know.
Islamological is a word. When it comes to two totally unrelated questions. So the first has to do with the kind of doctrinal content of the Salafism that you're arguing is kind of regnant or dominant in Egyptian society. How much of it do you think is predicated on the ideas of the Wahhabi da'wah that begins in the mid-18th century, which is very much a prominent feature of the jihadi Salafi texts that I study, in large part because it is so dominated by ideas of hatred and enmity and jihad and all of that good stuff. Or is it possible, or and this would be my guess, is do Egyptian kind of Salafi sheikhs and their followers, do they look more to the later Wahhabi tradition, like Ibn Baz and Ibn Uthaymeen? The other question that's completely unrelated to that is if you could just tell us what's going on with Salafis in Egypt today and their relationship to the current government. What's become of Hazm, Salah, Abu Ismail, and company? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cole. It's great to see you, and thanks for these two great questions. I don't want to get too specific, but I mean, the majority of Egyptian Salafis are not like Da'wah Najdiya Wahhabis, right? They're not like historical Wahhabis, the ones you've studied in your PhD. They're not that type. They tend to be, I mean, the figure that certainly dominates the field in terms of reference is Sheikh al-Albani, right? He's much more quoted because he is also much more, I mean, you know, in a context where, you know, Salafis have to live with non-Salafis, it's much easier to follow al-Albani because, you know, it's much more compromising in some ways, right? You do have in al-Albani, you know, ideas such as, I mean, kashf al-wajh, you know, you don't have to cover your face. Ideas that, you know, someone who, doesn't pray 5 times but has good reasons, whatever, you know, and I don't remember exactly how al-Albani frames it, but, you know, he would be more lenient, you know, towards not declaring those people to be not Muslim. So these are things in which, you know, al-Albani has a much stronger impact, and they would generally quote al-Albani. So you do find a more Wahhabi tradition in Ansar al-Sunnah, probably, that kind of sticks to the traditional Wahhabi line, although it would kind of follow the evolutions of the Wahhabi establishment in Saudi Arabia. So, you know, so they would not be Da'wah Najdiya either. They would not be 18th century Wahhabis either, right? And you would find a resurgence of 18th century Wahhabism's ideas, mainly in the jihadi currents, right? You know, where you would find, you know, after Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi and how, you know, jihadi started to dig into those texts to find justifications. So you would see a coexistence of these different types of Salafisms. Of course, you know, you probably would have to even, you know, look at for different, other figures as well. You know, Muqbil also does have students, Muqbil al-Wadi, the Yemeni scholar who was somehow close to al-Albani in many ways, but also had his own interpretation sometimes. So you do have divergences, right? Salafis agree on what I told you they agree, right? I tried to define, you know, when I define Salafism, I tried to give you what I see as the common points. But even within all those different Salafis in terms of, you know, who they look up to, and, you know, there would be slight differences on which authority, right? And well, your second question is great, and it probably requires a lot of time, but Salafis are not doing well today, right? I mean, I think that when I say 2011 is the culmination, I think their encounter with politics has had a very high cost to Salafis because they ended up making, you know, political choices that would end up costing them quite a bit, you know, and precisely, you know, when even when Hizb an-Nur, I told you, you know, decides that it wants to be only the lobbying arm of a religious organization because it doesn't want to play politics like an Islamist party, it ends up making choices, right? Against Morsi, pro-Sisi, sometimes changing its position because it has to, especially today, you know, it's the only party that is left in the Egyptian parliament. Now they have to put women on their lists and Copts, and they had always said they were against that. So, you know, and they have to do this because otherwise Sisi basically throws them in jail. So all of this kind of undermines their authority, you know, and their purity again, you know, because now, you know, again, Salafis were wary of politics, and there was a good reason for that. I think they kind of understood that, you know, going into politics would eventually kind of weaken their purest authority in many ways, right? And it did, right? I mean, they came out of the post-revolution in the post-revolution phase as having lost a lot of credibility, because because now, they said something and then they said the contrary, and then, and so all people who look up to them as representing some kind of religious truths could basically see them as much more fallible than they appear to be. And I think that that has kind of explained also, the fact that many Salafis sided with Sisi in Egypt, whereas a lot in the religious segments in Egypt didn't like Sisi. So, of course, again, that kind of also cost Salafis quite a bit. Hazm is probably the only one that retains an aura, almost mystical aura, right? He's in prison. He appears in courts once in a while. His followers are still very present on the internet, and they see him as some type of savior, type of messiah figure. Hazm, they would say, was the only one who understood everything. And there is a famous video by Hazm in March 2011, in which Hazm says that, what the army is going to do? The army is going to let an Islamist president be elected, then they're going to sabotage him, and then they're going to use this to come back. And the fact that Hazm said that in March 2011 kind of reinforces the belief among his followers that he kind of understood everything from the very beginning. He was the only guy who was politically aware. And so this kind of adds to the belief of his followers. So Hazm's followers are the only ones, and I think Hazm's figure actually will remain. I think this guy, will have a legacy, by the way. Among all these different figures, he will have a legacy. There will be a comeback of Hazm as a figure, I think, in the future. Not necessarily as he's in prison, right? So we don't know what will happen with him. But even if he dies in prison, this episode of Hazm will have a legacy.
So we are out of time. So I want to just thank Stéphane for an absolutely fascinating talk. It's a real thrill to have you online here. Even more so it would have been to have you in person, but we'll have to do that in the future. Thank you to all of you for coming and for all of your fascinating questions. And I look forward to seeing many of you around the UW campus, and the rest of you who don't live in Madison, I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure that if you have more questions, Aaron is just as, would respond to most of them. So just ask them to Aaron during next term.
Stéphane, be very careful. I'm gonna Zoom you during class and just let you answer them.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.